Good morning and welcome to our Newsmaker interview for today. I am privileged to have the honor of introducing Brad Wilcox, who is the director of the National Marriage Project. He's professor of sociology at the University of Virginia and a senior fellow with the Institute of Family Studies and is a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Professor Wilcox is co-author of Whither the Child, Causes and Consequences of Low Fertility, and his research has focused on marriage, fatherhood, and cohabitation, especially on the ways that family structure, civil society, and culture influence the quality and stability of family life in the United States and around the globe. Please join me in welcoming Professor Wilcox to the Newsmaker interviews.
Well, Brad, in the magazine business, sometimes we talk about trends, which are more short-term, and oozes, which are more long-term. Now, the statistics here on marriage are really striking. I mean, an ooze from 1970 to the present, white marriage rates fall from 70 to 49%, Latinos 72 to 47%, blacks from 54 to 25%. And then, of course, you have the other factor in here, namely children born out of wedlock. And from 1980 to 2011, among whites, 9 to 29%. Latinos 24 to 53%, and African Americans 56 to 72%. Now, that's an ooze in one sense in the magazine business, but thinking as an historian and a sociologist, this is a pretty short period of time to have such a radical transformation of American family life. What's going on, and what implications do you think that has?
Well, we certainly have seen a pretty dramatic retreat from marriage in the last 30 or 40 years in the U.S. I mean, really since the late 1960s, as you know. And I think that retreat's been driven by a couple of different economic and cultural factors, as well as policy factors. We have seen on the economic front, particularly less educated men are, they're employed less stably, their real incomes are down, and that matters because when men are not stably employed, they're less likely to get married and stay married, they're less attractive as potential husbands. So this economic shift away from an industrial economy towards a service economy has tended to benefit people who have more education and tended to undercut the value of particularly working class and poor men in our economy. On the cultural front, as you well know, there's been a pretty dramatic shift when it comes to religion, with many more Americans embracing a kind of a secular or unaffiliated identity with declines in church attendance. And that's important because religion tends to reinforce strong marriages. We've also seen kind of the rise of feminism, and I think that's, among other things, sort of raised the bar for what people expect from marriage, women expect from marriage. In some ways that's good. People who are married today, we've got often fathers who are more engaged practically with their families and their kids than was the case 50 years ago. But it also means, too, that people can be, I think, in a sense, too picky about entering into marriage and more likely to resort to divorce when there's some kind of difficulty or conflict. And then I think more broadly, we have seen a shift away from kind of community and tradition and authority and towards what some have called kind of expressive individualism, kind of following what you desire, what you feel, etc., but in ways that may not really serve your marriage well or your family well or your kids well. And so these cultural factors have kind of combined to undercut the strength of marriage. And finally, I would say too that on the public policy level, as you know, many of our public policies unintentionally end up penalizing marriage. It's for some lower-income mothers, it makes more sense, not to get married if you're concerned about things like Medicaid or food stamps or whatnot. And so the state has also, I think, played a role in the retreat from marriage, which has also probably, as you know, certainly has been really focused more among working class and poor Americans than it has for upper middle class or college educated Americans. So yeah, all these factors have helped to combine, kind of created a perfect storm where you have, economic, cultural, and policy forces all combining in the last 40 years or so, or 50 years or so, to undercut the strength and stability of marriage in American life.
Okay, so it's a big ball of string right now, but if you tried to isolate out particular fragments of it, could you prioritize those, or is it possible to say which of these is the most important factor?
My sense is that the cultural shifts, which I just touched upon, are probably the most important forces, but they've certainly worked in combination with the economic changes that we have seen and the policy shifts that we have seen since the 60s as well. So William Julius Wilson, who's a sociologist at Harvard, has basically made the point, for instance, that kind of our higher view of marriage in terms of delivering both emotional and to some extent financial satisfaction has made the relative fragility that less educated men face today in the labor force market more problematic vis-a-vis marriage, because back in 1930s, people would they managed to sort of forge ahead and maintain their marriages even in the face of tremendous economic difficulties. Once you have a more soulmate model of married life, or more capstone model of married life as we do today, people are more likely to wash their hands of their marriage or their spouse when financial difficulties hit. So that's, again, there's this interaction between culture and economics that's worth thinking about here.
So the capstone sense is, well, first you become mature, then you marry. But of course, marriage is a real prod toward maturity.
Correct.
So do we just, as we postpone, do we just exacerbate the problem?
So what we have seen in the U.S. is, I think, both a kind of soulmate model emerged since the 70s. People are looking for marriage as an opportunity to have an intense friendship / romance with someone, and the capstone model, where people are assuming you have to get everything, all your ducks in a row in terms of your education complete, your career launched, your life together more broadly before you get married. And the problem with that is that, as you were just, I think, alluding, is that for many adults, marriage can be, a spur, particularly men, to becoming more mature and more responsible. And so, and the other thing is that, particularly working class and poor Americans often feel like they don't have their ducks in a row, and so they don't get married, but they're still having kids, and that's obviously a problem.
So George Gilder, a generation ago, wrote a book with the very mellifluous title "Naked Nomads,"
right,
and about men and so forth, and that still pertains.
Correct. I mean, I think we still see that men who get married, they work more hours, about 400 hours more than their single peers. They earn more money. They tend to be more responsible at work, less likely to be fired. They go to church more often. They attend taverns less often. So, marriage really transforms men, shapes men in ways that, by and large are, quite helpful to both men, but also often to their neighborhoods and communities as well.
So I've noted, just in looking at websites and seeing the chatter, that both feminists and some people in what's called the men's rights movement both vilify you. Where's the greater hostility from?
Yeah, I'd say, for much of my career, I've dealt with, critiques, attacks, from the left, from both progressives and from feminists of some stripes. But more recently, I've gotten a lot more pushback from the men's rights crowd. There's a group called Men Going Their Own Way that's been quite concerned with some of my writing about the importance of marriage in men's lives. So their fundamental critique of my perspective is that today, given divorce laws and given divorce norms, that marriage is basically a bad deal for men. That you invest yourself emotionally, practically, financially in marriage, you have kids, and then 7 years later, 12 years later, you're divorced unwillingly, you've lost your kids, and you're stuck with a bill for child support, maybe alimony, and you've had to divvy up your property. And I think that critique has a certain power and merit to it. I think divorce law is not particularly just right now, but it's also important to recognize that most marriages today do not end in divorce, and that men who are diligent about working, who attend church with their spouse regularly, who are emotionally engaged in their marriages, and who don't abuse drugs and alcohol, men who do those four things have a pretty slim chance of getting divorced. So I think we have to sort of recognize that, yes, divorce is a problem. I think divorce law today in America tends to be pretty unjust in many cases. But it's also the case, too, that by doing a couple of important things, you can dramatically minimize your risk of divorce if you're an American man.
How would you change divorce laws?
Well, I think in terms of looking at the issue of divorce, in kind of the ideal world, I think we would take into account when it comes to custody and the division of property, whether or not either spouse had kind of engaged in sort of a major breach of the marital contract, so to speak. If they had engaged in infidelity or physical abuse or emotional abuse, drugs or alcohol, or otherwise been kind of absent from the marriage. And that we wouldn't go back to a no-fault model, but that we just sort of try to take these factors into account in apportioning and figuring out, how custody arrangements are made and how property is divided. That would inject a certain measure of justice into the system that is now, I think, often lacking. So often you'll see spouses, and could be either the male or female, where one, has an affair and then wants a divorce, and the other spouse is kind of left reeling and may lose, primary custody, or may lose a substantial share of their assets in the wake of a divorce. And sort of the adult behavior that preceded the divorce is often not taken into account when it comes to both custody and or property division, and that's problematic.
So you would get rid of no-fault divorce laws?
No, what I'm saying is that I think it would be helpful for us to think about ways to reform divorce law. I'm not saying that we'd go back to the fault-based divorce laws of, say, the 50s and 60s, where you often couldn't get divorced unless you could show some kind of breach of marital contract. But I'm just sort of saying, as we think about going forward, taking into account what sort of preceded the divorce would be helpful. So yeah, I would get rid of no-fault divorce, but I would not go back to fault-based divorce. I would try to sort of move in a direction where you're taking into account, to some extent, as you think about custody and property division, what precipitated the divorce.
So you're saying allow divorce, but take into account these other factors as far as property and
right. In the interest of both the interest of justice, if you will, and in the interest of kind of recognizing that that marriage is an important institution, and that we should do more legally to support it than we currently do.
Okay. Just going back to some of your earlier work, looking at this title from 2004, Soft Patriarchs, New Men, How Christianity Shapes Fathers and Husbands. So how does Christianity shape fathers and husbands?
Well, the basic argument of the book basically is that Christianity kind of domesticates men. And by using the term domesticate, what I'm saying basically is that it turns men's hearts and minds towards the home, towards the family. And more particularly, we find in this research that men who are church-going tend to embrace more familistic attitudes. They tend to sort of place a premium on marriage and parenting. And that kind of familistic mindset then translates into being more emotionally engaged with their spouses, with their wife, and more emotionally and practically engaged with their children. They're more likely to volunteer for Boy Scouts. They're more likely to read to their kids. They're more likely to hug and praise their children. So that's sort of what I would mean by the way in which I think religion tends to domesticate men. And what's interesting too, when you look at sort of the nexus between religion, men, and family, is that sort of feminists tend to be concerned about kind of the traditionalistic character of religion. They sort of see it as a kind of a patriarchal institution, and that religion might sort of reinforce kind of patriarchy in some important way. What they tend to miss, though, is this kind of familistic side to religion, and that is that religion tends to encourage men to put their families first, to put their marriage first, to put their kids first. And if you look at it just from a simple kind of sort of a statistical approach, when I measure familism in my models by attitudes to things like divorce and whatnot, and I measure gender traditionalism in my models by things like attitudes towards who does what around the house and whatnot, and then look at religion and family outcomes, I find that sort of religiosity and familism are much more important in predicting men's engagement in their marriages and with their kids than is their attitude towards gender roles.
Well, let me ask, the title of the book was How Christianity Shapes,
Right.
but you've just been mentioning more about religion generally.
Sure.
Historically, I suspect people have found that Christianity actually very liberating for women,
Right.
given ancient civilization and the
Right.
differences there.
Right.
So when you say religion generally, does that shade the differences, let's say, between Christianity and Islam?
That's a great question. Certainly, Rodney Stark's work suggests that in ancient Rome, Christianity played a pretty important role in elevating the status of women. I don't really know enough about Islam kind of globally to sort of answer that question. What I would say is that when we look at kind of evangelical Protestantism, mainline Protestantism, Catholicism, and Judaism in the United States, that I found kind of both a generic religion effect, but then I've also kind of found an effect for evangelicalism that's distinct. So on kind of the generic side of the ledger, people who attend Jewish, Protestant, mainline or evangelical Protestant churches tend to be more engaged with their family members. They tend to be less likely to get divorced. So there are a lot of sort of generically constructive or good outcomes. Where there are some distinctive tradition-specific effects are that evangelical Protestants tend to be, of the major traditions in the U.S., the most engaged with their kids. And they're also, I think, their churches are more successful in kind of appealing to men and getting men to think in a very intentional way about their families, sort of think about their kids in terms of not just sort of Harvard, but also heaven. And that kind of lends itself to a certain distinctive parenting style that in the main I think is valuable for the kids and families in that tradition.
Okay, thinking more about kids then, one of the political and cultural divides often concerns childcare, where secularists tend to be more in favor of often publicly funded childcare,
Sure.
and getting kids out. Christians tend to be more familial oriented.
Right.
What's best for kids?
Well, I think there's certainly a lot of debates out there about sort of kids who are 2, 3, 4, and 2, 3, and 4, sort of the pre-K years. But I think that most scholars who are honest about the data would acknowledge that first year of life, it's really better for a child to have lots of bonding time, usually with his or her mother. And we know that particularly kids who spend more than 30 hours a week in some kind of institutional childcare are more likely to have social and emotional problems as kids compared to kids who are not exposed to that amount of childcare. So what I would say in terms of the bottom line here is I think the first year of life is definitely ideal for for someone to be at home, usually the mother. And then beyond that, I think it's going to depend to some extent on the child, and the parents, and what people can afford to do. But that first year of life I think is pretty important.
So what public policy changes would encourage more staying at home with that first year?
Sure. So I think on the sort of work-family front, there's been a big push of late to expand either subsidies of childcare or to expand a tax credit that's sort of targeting childcare per se. And in place of that kind of approach, I'd much prefer that we expand the child tax credit to $3,000 per child, 4 and under, and that money would be, in a sense, kind of given to families to do as they please. You kind of recognize that we live in a very pluralistic country. Different parents want to do things differently, and let parents decide about how to use that money. Some are going to use it to have a mom at home. Some are going to use that to hire a neighbor to watch the kids. Some are going to use that for paid childcare, but kind of let families decide about how to do that. And I think, given what we see in the attitudinal data, is that many families would choose, with more resources or that flexibility, to have a parent at home full time, or to be juggling between parents and grandparents, things like that.
2014, you were the co-director of the World Family Map Project. Tell us about that.
So the Real Family Map Project is an effort from a number of different scholars, really across, we have scholars who have been involved in Europe and Latin America and Asia in this initiative. We're just trying to kind of map out what's happening to the family in terms of family structure, family economics, family culture, family process. And we've tackled a range of different things, from the link between family structure and kids' educational outcomes to work-family issues globally. And then more recently, we just did a report that came out last month on cohabitation and family stability for kids. And I think in terms of what's interesting about the project is that it allows us to kind of look at key family issues from a global perspective and define things that are often surprising. So anyone who knows my work would know that I'm a big fan of fathers. I think that the two-parent family is very important. Dads are important. And so I assume when we kind of launched our report and project back in 2013 on family structure and kids' educational attainment, that we would find that kids in two-parent families across the globe did better in school than kids who were being raised, say, by single-parent families. And to our surprise, we found that in some parts of Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa and Southern Asia, that was not the case. And so I had to kind of re-examine some of my presuppositions about fathers and family structure. And as I kind of digged into this issue, I discovered that, well, in some places, in some cultures, dads don't really play a big role when it comes to their kids' education. And they may not really even be devoting a substantial share of their income or salary to their kids' education or even their well-being. And so I sort of realized that, sort of the value of the kind of the natural family or the intact family depends to an important extent on an ethic of paternal involvement and paternal solicitude that is, not going to be found, sort of enculturated, if you will, in every part of the world. So that's one example of the kind of work that we're doing with this project.
Well, and then going back to in 2011, the State of Our Unions project, you talked about how God-centeredness in marriage makes a huge difference. I mean, a key factor in preventing divorce, but also a key factor in raising children well. So it just strikes me that in all these things where you're finding out about the importance of fathers, the importance of marriage, the importance of the first year, the importance of God-centeredness, if we found in a variety of public policy things, when you see such an important factor, you would think people would say, wow, we have found a magic bullet here. Let's make sure that we really emphasize that. Yet here, there's a lot of pushback against that. So what does that say about our society and our sense of what's really important?
So you're saying was the term you're using God something?
Yeah, I think I see that you identified God-centeredness in marriage, defined as both husband and wife seeing God as the center of the marriage.
Right. Yeah. So in one report that we did, we found that couples who reported kind of an intense engagement with God were much more likely to report that they're happy. In our new book, Soulmates, that I did with Nicholas Wolfinger, we find that probably the most powerful predictor on the religious side of things of happy marriages is when a couple prays together outside of just grace at meals. And so those two findings are suggestive of the power of religious faith in family life. Now I think we also know too from some work done by Tyler Vanderweel, who's a professor at Harvard. He's tracking thousands of women in the United States, across many years, that his work suggests that women who are attending church regularly are about 40% less likely to get divorced than their female peers who are not attending church. So these are just some of the findings that are sort of indicative of the connection between faith and family today in America. But I think, as you well know, there are plenty of folks who see religion as a baleful force in American life, and so they're not much inclined to either give credence to these kinds of findings or to think much about them. And from a policy perspective, there's not much obviously the government can directly do to strengthen religious faith. So that's, I think, another sort of factor that's also obviously relevant in talking about the role of the state in all of this.
Yeah, when I was involved a lot in debates on poverty, and you see all the research showing that God-centeredness there makes a huge difference. And so I would sometimes put it rather aggressively to people basically who said, I really am concerned about poverty, and I would sometimes aggressively say,
Right.
well, which do you hate more? Do you hate poverty more? Or do you hate God more?
Right.
What do you do to try to break through that huge barrier against acknowledging the huge difference that God-centeredness makes?
Well, I think, I've looked at these issues more from the perspective of sort of marriage and family structure than this sort of God factor that you're talking about. But I think it's a similar argument. And what I would say is that people who are more progressive at least need to grapple with, the fact that religion does tend to, when practiced, lift the fortunes of the poor. In fact, Robert Putnam's new book, Our Kids, talks in the end about how in some ways it looks like religious faith is more beneficial to, poor African American kids than it is to other kids. So to kind of just sort of recognize and grapple with the sort of reality both of faith for the poor and also for African Americans in particular, and the important role that faith has played in the lives of both lower-income Americans and African Americans. So that's, I think, one way to get people to think about this issue a bit more. And I think it's also too helpful for people who are open to this to kind of, to really visit and engage with, churches or with faith-based organizations that are working on the ground to address homelessness, poverty, or other things, that where there's some kind of common agreement about these are things we should be concerned about.
Mm-hmm. One thing that surprised me in your recent work on cohabitation, you found a huge rate of cohabitation in South America, far beyond the rate in European countries or in the United States. What's going on?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things about this new work we're doing on cohabitation is that I thought this was just kind of a Swedish thing. And it's just something that's, it's in Northern Europe,
Swedes,
and it's sort of, it's coming to the U.S. to some extent, and, and it's in Quebec and, France and whatnot. And to my surprise, as I've looked at this sort of issue, again, globally, it's really a huge factor in Latin America. So if you look at kind of where kids most likely be living in a cohabiting family, it's in Colombia, in South America. And there's been a dramatic increase in Argentina and Chile, to some extent in Mexico. And I would say that there are two things to mention in terms of Latin America. One is that there has been, for a very long time, a tradition of informal unions in Latin America among the poor. So cohabitation has been very much a part of the family fabric of many Latin American societies, although it's a much more stable pattern of cohabitation than we have seen here in the U.S., in the last 30, 40 years. But it's part of the cultural fabric to some extent in Latin America for a very long time. What's changed, though, is that that's moved up the ladder in terms of more and more middle class and even upper class Latin Americans are having their kids in a cohabiting union. That's different. And I think that's kind of more a reflection of the effect that, the sexual revolution, the expressive individualist character of our modern world, et cetera, are having on relationships in general. So I think that's, sort of in some way a reflection of just sort of some broader cultural currents that are coming from, Europe and the U.S. and permeating middle and upper classes in Latin America.
Now, I'm wondering, there's been an enormous explosion of evangelical understanding in Latin America.
Right.
And you would think, in a sense, that would work against cohabitation, but I'm wondering, insofar as it may be more individualistic and breaking away from some of the traditions in the Catholic Church, is the explosion of evangelical understanding and the explosion of cohabitation ironically going on, influencing each other?
I don't think that evangelicalism in Latin America is directly influencing cohabitation, but I think perhaps a more underlying individualistic spirit, which has become more prevalent in these societies, could on the one hand make evangelicalism more attractive to some people living in Central and South America, and at the same time would explain why a more traditional view of marriage or experience of marriage has lost ground in Latin America.
Okay.
I mean, so I don't think they're directly affecting one another, but they could certainly be, to some extent, flourishing in their own ways because of a shift towards a more westernized or individualistic model of life.
Okay, let's go to your most recent book, Soulmates, right? Subtitled Religion, Sex, Love, and Marriage Among African Americans and Latinos. Despite the very sexy title, it's an Oxford University Press from last year. Tell us your major thesis there.
Well, there are basically, I think, two ideas we're trying to advance in Soulmates. One is that we know, in fact, former President Obama sort of stressed this, we know that in some important ways, African American men, and to some extent Latino men, are more likely to be struggling, both in general but also in the family in particular. And yet we know that the vast majority, say, of African American men, will not be incarcerated, are not poor, are not unemployed, and also will get married. And so we wanted to sort of explore how religion actually plays an important role for Black and Latino men in terms of cultivating what we call a code of decency, and that encompasses things like hard work, being responsible, being civil, and therefore being a better spouse, better parent, etc. So one part of the book is about kind of showing how religion, Christianity is a force for this code of decency among African Americans and Latinos. And the second kind of part of the book is just to sort of show how, in many respects, religion fosters, better families for Blacks and Latinos in much the same way it does for whites. And there are some important, variations on that story. But we found that African Americans and Latinos who attended church together were much more likely to report happy marriages compared to those who did not. They're more likely to get married. They're less likely to have kids outside of wedlock. And so kind of, again, the sort of story that faith tends to help strengthen families was sort of the second key part of our story, and that was true for whites, for Blacks, and Latinos in our analysis in the book. So those are thinking again about kind of religion, men and the family as it relates to Black and Latino men, and then thinking just more generally about how religion is a force for good in the main among Black and Latino families.
What kind of pushback did you get? Because here are two white guys doing research and writing about Blacks and Latinos.
There actually wasn't a lot of pushback on this particular book, and I'm not sure, why that's the case. I think probably part of this, the reason is that it's a pretty positive story. There's not a lot, unless you have a real strong ideological axe to grind. There's not a lot, I think, in the book to really go after from. There's not a lot. I mean, I don't think it's that controversial in that sense.
But let me go back to those statistics I mentioned at the outset, that right now most Latino kids, most Black kids are being born out of wedlock. So how do you start to reverse that?
That's a great question. So I would sort of, talking about Latinos, we have to sort of acknowledge that it's more at kind of, it's that they're at a tipping point, basically, where about half of kids are, born in marriage, but half are not, and where marriage is still kind of has an important purchase in the Latino community. And so for Latinos, I would sort of say it's about trying to kind of solidify the existing, marriages in the community and sort of lift them up and to try to, reverse the trend. For African Americans, marriage is a much more precarious place. And I think to kind of really reverse that is going to require a lot more sort of policy and cultural and economic work. In terms of African American families and marriage, what I would say is that one of the things that we can do is to look at the U.S. military. And what you see actually in the American military is there's not a real racial divide when it comes to who's getting married. Blacks and whites get married at roughly the same rates in American military, and that's the only place that happens in the country, which is kind of...
Most get married?
Yes.
Okay.
And there's not a real racial divide in terms of... and so what's happening in the military is that, on the one hand, this is sort of more the progressive, I think, takeaway, is that you have stable work, decent paying, jobs. You have access to either free or reasonable housing. and free health care. So that's interesting. But then you also have, on the other hand, this is more of the conservative point I think one can make, is you have a culture that still, to an important extent, does sort of honor marriage and a certain traditional American family life. You also have policies that basically say you can't get access to these benefits if you're cohabiting. So if you want to have housing on base, you got to be married, And so there's a marriage norm there, and it's just striking. This is again one of the few places where race doesn't seem to make a big difference in American family life. So kind of take the model of trying to sort of look at the economic piece on the one hand, but for African American men, and at the same time also kind of to norm marriage on the other hand. And then the third thing that I would say about African Americans is there has to, I think, have to be kind of Black leaders who take this issue for themselves and see it as an issue and express it as an issue really of community uplift, to recognize that sort of the welfare of African American communities and the African American people, so to speak, depends upon, in part, many things, but it depends in part upon strengthening Black families and making sure that more African American kids are growing up in a home with their mother and their father.
So I've talked with some Black preachers who just really won't preach about it because they're afraid of alienating many members of their congregation who are cohabiting.
Sure.
How do you?
Yeah, and that's something. So I did a lot of interviews with Black and Latino clergy and laity in New York City, in Harlem, and Brooklyn, the Bronx, and there are plenty of pastors and lay leaders who say we don't really we'll talk about things like drug use, alcohol use, the importance of work, the importance of honesty, sort of a bunch of different virtues and values. But we're not going to necessarily go right on the issue of sex or marriage because it does tend to make the congregation more uncomfortable. And I can understand and appreciate that, but I would also sort of say that, again, sort of from the longer term perspective, if we're really concerned about advancing racial equality in America, we have to have families that are more equal. And that means figuring out a way to strengthen marriage and to have more African American families where the father is in the home on a day-to-day basis, day in and day out basis. And so if that kind of argument, I think, can be advanced, that would be really, both from the pulpit and in kind of more intellectual and professional circles among African Americans, that would be really helpful. But it's not right now making any headway.
Okay. So it sounds like both pastors and HHS or HUD officials can learn a lot from the military.
Yes, and journalists and policymakers and academics who kind of write and talk about issues of race in America. It's unfortunate that as we talk about race a lot in the last 5 or 6 years, we haven't really had a constructive conversation about how family intersects with race in America.
Mm-hmm. Couple of public policy questions. Earned income tax credit, is that helpful or harmful?
I think the earned income tax credit's been helpful in terms of rewarding work among lower income Americans. There are, in some cases, marriage penalties that hit lower income families. So I think we could think about ways to address the marriage penalties. But I think in terms of trying to reward work, it's been helpful.
So you mentioned in your book, you mentioned Victory Chapel in the Bronx, a couple of others. So of all the places you've seen in neighborhoods, and particularly, I guess I'm asking about Christian places, although if there are others, mention them. What's your favorite? What do you think? I'm asking here as a magazine editor.
Right.
On what group should we have feature stories?
Well, the churches that we profiled in the book, we changed some identifying details just to kind of, give really the families that were profiled in the book, some, and then with some confidentiality. But I was pretty impressed with a number of the Pentecostal churches serving either both Black and Latino families or serving Latino or African American families in Harlem, the Bronx, and Brooklyn. So there are a couple of those churches that seem to be combining a really kind of dynamic form of preaching and worship with a real commitment to discipling and sort of community engagement that was pretty impressive.
So sometimes you say you've changed the names or changed the
In the books, in the Soulmates book, basically everyone, we changed the name and changed the name of the congregation just to give those people who are profiled some degree of privacy.
Okay, well, I'll ask you more about that
Okay.
later, but and we'll go to your questions in a moment. Let me just ask one more question now. Given what you've seen and the way that lots of Latino congregations are really stepping up and being very helpful, how does this influence your thinking about this vexatious current question of immigration?
Well, what's the question about, sort of in terms of how?
I'm just saying you've seen a lot of positives as you've gone around looking at particular Latino congregations. There's a lot of negativity out there concerning new immigrants from Mexico and other places further south.
Right.
How does what you've seen in doing this research affect your thinking about whether these immigrants are good for America or bad for America?
Well, I think that's a complicated question, and I think that in many important respects, immigrants are good for America, and the immigrants that I spoke to and studied for Soulmates were generally people who were integrated into a church community and were doing really well on a variety of different levels. I think that's all true. It's also the case, though, that there is some evidence that native-born Americans who don't have college degrees have seen their job opportunities and their wages decline to some extent because of the influx of a large number of immigrants in the country. And so I think those two things are both true, and that we should be thinking about kind of moving forward the sort of the value of perhaps reducing immigration to some extent and with a view towards protecting the economic well-being of Americans who are, some of whom are of course now immigrants. So that's sort of what I would say. I'd also say too, it's important to recognize too that Latin America is really changing as well, and in two important ways. One is that fertility has come down dramatically in Latin America, including Mexico, and the standard of living has increased pretty dramatically in Latin America, including Mexico. What that means longer term is there's going to be less of a need for younger adults from Latin America to migrate into the U.S. and pursue economic opportunities.
Okay. Questions? We have a microphone somewhere over there, and she'll pass it to whoever raises a hand.
Hi there. I'm one of the staff members here at Patrick Henry and a graduate of 2015. And I'm sorry I missed the talk. I thought it was at 12:40. So I was wondering what your definition of religion is. Are you including all congregations of all religions, or are you focusing on structured Christian churches? Do you make any delineations between the different denominations in your research? Sure. And then a second question that's unrelated is, how do you present your research, because it's so centered on religion, at a state university such as the University of Virginia? Is it well received by colleagues and students?
So two good questions. When I look at religion, I'm thinking about kind of in a Durkheimian sense, and by that I mean basically anything that people sort of perceive as supernatural, that entails things like rituals and some kind of community. So that could include, Jews, Catholics, Protestants, Muslims, etc. But I focus primarily in the United States when it comes to religion and family, and so necessarily I'm looking more at mainline Protestants, Catholics, and evangelical Protestants as the sort of three biggest groups in the U.S. When it comes to kind of religious practice and their family lives. What I found is that there are some kind of generic religious effects that we kind of could attribute to kind of the power of religious ritual and the power of religious community, I think. And then there are some tradition-specific effects. And I mentioned before, for instance, that evangelicals, I think, do a particularly good job of trying to reach men and motivate men to focus more on their families. That's because they tend to have a certain kind of language. They tend to have more men's ministries and activities that are geared towards men. And in sort of doing that, they're then more successful at reaching men. I'd say probably the same thing is true for Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews in terms of kind of, there are a lot of things that are targeting men in that community. In terms of the second question, talking about religion at a public university, religion is an important sort of part of our social fabric. And I think, if we can talk about class or race or ethnicity or region, in American family life, which we do, we can talk about religion. It's an important part of the fabric of American life. And I try to approach it from a fairly, objective, social scientific perspective. And also, I think I'm pretty honest about recognizing that religion's not always a good thing in American families. So for instance, when spouses do not agree about their faith, or one is, if you have, say, kind of a more fundamental Protestant man married to a progressive secular woman, we can see in the data that that's a recipe for disaster. There's more violence, there's more divorce, there's lower marital quality. So we have to acknowledge that religion tends to be a force for good when there's a degree of uniformity on the part of the spouses, when it's a source of sort of solidarity in the family. And when it's a source of division, it can be really a negative force. So kind of just being clear and honest about those sort of social scientific facts, I think, is helpful. Sure.
The research that you've done with regard to intact families, and I think that's very important. Does the research make any distinction between traditional and non-traditional marriages?
Not really right now. The sort of vast majority of research that's been done on family structure and child well-being has been done looking at heterosexual, families where, they're intact bio, they're adoptive, they're step, they're cohabiting, and single parents. And in that research, what we have seen is that kids who are being raised by their intact biological married families are, more likely to flourish. And kids that are raised in other kinds of families are more likely to flounder, so to speak. But recognizing in all of this that, most kids who are raised in some kind of non-intact family or non-biological family do fine. I was raised by a single mom. I've turned out well in most respects, if not all. And my experience is, emblematic of how many kids from single-parent families turn out. But I'm also a sociologist, and I would say that, on average, kids are more likely to flourish when they have the benefit of being raised by their own married parents. And I think most scholars would acknowledge that, who are doing serious work with the data. And where there is disagreement, I think, is about kind of, same-sex marriage and whether two stably married gay or lesbian parents will be as, successful as two heterosexual, stably married parents. And sort of the jury's still out on that question. I think we'll know, from a kind of sociological and psychological perspective, with a sort of a good longitudinal, large-scale study, we should have some pretty good answers, I think, in the next, 5 or 10 years about that question. So.
I'm wondering if you can speak to pop culture. Can you think of a television show that's particularly damaging or corrosive towards family life? And then is there a finding that you've thought, wow, this would be great to see in a television show?
That's a great question. So my intuition here, my scholarly intuition, is that a lot of the pop culture has been kind of corrosive of strong marriages and strong families. But one of sort of the unfortunate things in the academy is that we don't tend to study the impact in a very sort of systematic way of sort of pop cultural consumption of family life. We tend to study things like economics, public policies. We haven't I haven't really seen studies that really do a good job of trying to measure and evaluate how the quantity or the quality of your engagement with, say, TV or now social media, really affects marriages and families. But my intuition is there are some negative effects. And the one study that I've seen that's, I think, pretty provocative on this front is that there's a study in Brazil looking at sort of when TV was rolled out. And so what they did is they built television towers in different parts of Brazil at different times. So it's sort of a perfect natural experiment. You kind of can see, well, TV got this in this region in Brazil at this point, say 1973, and it got to this point, in this region in 1977. And then sort of to track younger adults, growing up in those different regions over time, to sort of see how their family patterns change. What they found is that fertility came down pretty dramatically in regions where TV first hit, and marriage went down and single parenthood went up. And what was also happening too at this time is that they were introducing telenovelas, which had a kind of overly sort of romanticized / consumeristic vision of life, that was being kind of broadcast on Brazilian TV. So it was also part of the story in the Brazilian case. But so this is kind of suggestive of the fact that pop culture, I think, can and often does have, I think, negative impacts on families. We haven't really seen them, kind of, in my view, well studied here in the U.S. Now, in terms of kind of on the constructive side of things, we have seen in the United States efforts on the part of the National Campaign to Prevent Teen and Now Unplanned Pregnancy, working with MTV, working with TV producers to insert different messages about teen pregnancy. And many of them, I think, have been, both compelling and successful. And I think, the challenge, though, is that we haven't seen a kind of an equivalent effort to really, I think, depict, say, marriage and fatherhood, not in a sort of a rose-colored lens or sort of, treacly way, but in an honest and compelling way that's, that's also positive. Although there are some shows that I think end up presenting a pretty good model of family life, just in the course of the dramatic play, but not enough. So.
Which shows?
Well, there's a new show, for instance, I've seen called Lethal Weapon. It's a play on it's on Fox. It's a play on the movies, and it's not entirely, there's some problematic parts of it, but the family, the African American family, it's the heart of that show, is a great family. They've got middle-aged couple struggling with middle-aged, marriage stuff, but they're funny and they love each other, and they're warm and authentic and vulnerable, and their kids are happy, and yet having their teenage moments, and they have a new baby. It's a great model of family life. So there are examples where that can be done. I think it'd be nice to see more of that.
Thanks so much for coming out. Earlier on in your talk, you mentioned this kind of theory of, or more the perspective of kind of a capstone perspective of marriage, of how you have to have your life together before getting married.
Yeah.
I was curious, how does that relate to the statistics as far as the age of people getting married? And then how does that relate to the success of the marriage in the future? How does that work together?
Well, so I mentioned that kind of today, a lot of younger adults and their parents embrace the capstone model. Again, that's the idea that you got to get all your ducks in a row before you get married. All your schooling is done, you've gotten launched into your career, et cetera. And the older model, obviously, is sort of marriage as the cornerstone to adult life. That you get married and then you kind of maybe finish your education, or you look around for a job, and all that kind of stuff. But I think your question is, well, how does sort of the age at marriage relate to marital success? And there are kind of two different ways of answering that question. If you focus just on kind of your risk of divorce, kind of generically, what you see is that people who get married in their late 20s and early 30s have the lowest risk of divorce. Although some colleagues have done some work for our blog, Family Studies, that shows that couples who get married younger, where both are attending church, have a reduced risk of divorce. So in other words, if you're a young married couple, you should be attending church together in terms of reducing risk of divorce. But on the marital quality front, the numbers are different. So we find for marital quality, and this is again sort of the average couple in America, getting married in your mid-20s, say 23 to 26, is associated with the highest quality marriages. So it's just interesting to note that marital quality and divorce are two different outcomes. And for the sort of the generic couple, getting married in your late 20s or early 30s in America is linked to the lowest risk of divorce. But when it comes to marital quality, kind of getting married in your mid-20s, broadly defined, is linked to the happiest marriages. And I think on the marital quality front, couples who get married in their mid-20s they tend to be more matched religiously, and they also, I think, probably are better able to kind of establish a kind of a common way of life together, traditions, vacations, holidays, and kind of a common perspective and outlook that's probably linked to a higher quality marriage. Whereas the folks who are getting married somewhat later on the divorce front probably enjoy a bit more maturity, financial stability, and whatnot that may help explain why they're somewhat less likely to get divorced on average.
So proponents of cohabitation tend to say, well, we live together for a while, we try it out, and that'll make for a better marriage. What does the research show about that?
So I teach a big sociology of family class at the University of Virginia, and the vast majority of my students think that cohabitation is a good way to prepare for marriage. And there's no evidence, though, that that's true. There's a lot of debate among scholars about whether or not cohabitation is a risk for marital dysfunction and divorce. And more conservative people like myself would say yes. And more progressive scholars would say, well, if you control for this and that, the answer is no. I think where we could find some agreement on that question is it looks like it's pretty clear for couples, the couples who cohabit prior to an engagement are more likely to experience divorce and marital unhappiness. And one of the ideas here is from Scott Stanley, who is a professor of psychology at the University of Denver. He has this idea of sliding versus deciding. And his idea is that a lot of younger adults today, they slide through major relationship, milestones, and they end up just kind of getting together over a weekend and then spending a couple nights together, over the course of a month, and then just kind of like moving in together. They've never had a serious conversation about their future, their common goals, their hobbies, their religious values, where they would like to live. And they've also really never figured out if they're on the same page in terms of where they see it heading. So you might have someone who's cohabiting to save on the rent, and his partner is looking at this as an opportunity to test the waters for marriage. And of course, if that's the mindset of these two people, they're going to face some real problems probably pretty darn quick in their relationship. So again, Stanley's perspective suggests that cohabitation is problematic in part because it allows a lot of young adults just to kind of slide through major milestones in the relationship rather than to be kind of decisive about, look, we're going to do this together. We have a friendship, a love that, should end up heading towards, marriage. And they're not doing that. They're just kind of hanging out, and there's not a lot of clarity and decisiveness and commitment that's mutual, and that's problematic.
Okay, maybe time for one more question.
Just quickly to go back for a moment to what you're talking about religion, have you seen some kind of examples of different religions and their effect on marriage? Maybe give an example from a Muslim family or from a Buddhist family, just to kind of get outside of a Christian framework and worldview, which has some ideas about how marriage should work. These other religions tie some pretty significant ideas to human nature and marriage.
That's a great question. I really don't have a good answer to it because I haven't studied Muslim families in any detail, nor have I studied Buddhist families outside of the United States. But I would certainly guess that tradition does matter to an important extent, and so insofar as they have different understandings of male authority or divorce or any other kind of major issue that's sort of family related that could have an impact on the quality and stability of life in Muslim families or in Buddhist families. But I don't know enough about those two different traditions internationally. I wouldn't want to say anything, but I would, in terms of coming back to the U.S., I would just say that, so, for instance, evangelicalism, I think, does better than many on this sort of, on the male front, but I would also say, and I'm Catholic, that, Catholics divorce less than Protestants. I think that's part and parcel of the Catholic stress on sort of the sacramentality of marriage and the permanency of marriage as part of our own tradition. So again, I think, generally speaking, religion has, at least in the U.S., a pretty good effect on families and marriages, but different traditions do different things, and some of those things are obviously related to the outcomes that you see in the data.
Hey, one quick question. Comparing cohabitation and marriage and the effect on, once people are cohabiting and have kids, does it make a difference whether they're married or not as far as the effect on kids?
So again, it's interesting. If you look at the issue of cohabitation from adults' perspective, or from an adult's perspective in the United States, I think that kind of, in a sense, liberal and conservative family scholars could debate about, is cohabitation really per se problematic? Because the evidence there is a bit more mixed. If you turn your focus to kids, I think there's really no debate. And that's because both in the United States and some other research we've been doing lately and elsewhere shows that kids who are born to married parents are much more likely to live stably with their parents than kids who are born to cohabiting families. And it makes sense because cohabitation gives adults freedom and flexibility, but the flip side to that is, of course, less commitment, less trust, less emotional security, and then less stability for those very same couples, which is not good for kids. And what's interesting is that when you talk about cohabitation and its instability among academics, journalists, and even sort of educated professionals who have work that takes them to Europe, they'll say, well, yeah, in the US, cohabitation is unstable. But in Europe, it's functionally equivalent to marriage. In Sweden or Norway or in France. And so we just did a report on cohabitation globally and found that in both the United States and Europe, kids are about 90% more likely to see their parents break up by age 12 if their parents are cohabiting at birth compared to kids who are born to married parents. This is true basically in Norway, in France, and Italy, so North, sort of Central and Southern Europe. So it suggests that the stability and advantage of marriage is not just an American thing. It's not just a religious or a Protestant thing. It's sort of potentially kind of a human thing. And that's because, again, marriage is an institution that has certain kind of norms and rituals, conventions that signal, commitment, stability, fidelity in ways that tend to reinforce stability for kids.
Interesting. Okay, well, Charles Murray is going to be here at 4 o'clock, and if you read news stories about his foray to Middlebury College, where he was mobbed, chanted at, harassed, and so forth, I expect and hope the welcome here will be a little different. Right now, please join me in thanking Dr. Wilcox.
Thanks,